Good morning, everyone. I want to talk for a few minutes about the types of processes and relationships that allow us to believe two things. One is that this managerial and market-oriented approach to protecting nature, what we would call green capitalism, is both possible, one, and desirable, two. This is something that I've been studying for about the past 18 years in three contexts. The first I would like to mention, and is also the most recent, is as part of a network of scholars, conservation practitioners, community activists, and journalists who have we've come together because of our concern about the types of things that we're concerned about in this room. But the other thing that brought us together is our common experience of being disciplined, marginalized, and discredited for saying the kind of things that we've been saying here today and that I'm going to continue saying now. But being part of this network, which includes Sean and is supported by Michelle through IIED at a time when very few people or institutions are actually willing to support what we do, and also includes Zoe over there behind the camera, who's helping us with how do you get these types of issues out into the public realm and not just in a room like this. I've learned a lot from talking to these people, so it's also part of how I understand these things. I've also worked since the early 1990s in Tanzania, where I originally was looking at a conflict between a national park and a local community, which got translated into something called community conservation, and then ultimately became something called large landscape conservation. And what I noticed during this transition was that questions about rights and democracy fell away towards questions of how do you create value that can generate the resources that will make it possible to manage the landscapes and people in such a way that they're both ecologically and economically functional. And then the last context for me, which is also a relatively recent context, is in post-Katrina New Orleans. And post-Katrina New Orleans, what I'm seeing in that context is the idea of rebuilding a green city with a market-driven approach is displacing communities of people who I've learned through my research, among other things, were actually food producers through direct engagements with their landscapes in urban contexts in all kinds of ways, which I don't have time to talk to you about, but they're very interesting. So, in terms of summing up what I've learned through all this, I'd just like to say three things. First, as Sean has already mentioned, the idea that we can fix our current global socio-environmental predicament with managerial expertise and free markets is problematic for three reasons. The first is that it requires us to conflate, to actually make a mistake about the difference between market systems and ecosystems. In other words, it requires us to conceptualize market systems and ecosystems as synonymous with one another. And you see this from two perspectives. First of all, the idea that you can make market mechanisms compatible with ecosystems requires the idea that they have to be comparable systems. And there's very, very complex managerial approaches to this that are based on this premise. The other one is that in yesterday's Independent, which Sean had with her, there was a statement to the effect that the bailout of banks in the United States by the U.S. government hadn't worked because the global debt crisis had become too great a force of nature for governments to intervene in. So there's a big conceptual mistake being made, and it's a very dangerous one. Next, it requires us to lose sight of two very important connections. Connections between people and the environment. And here again, this is what I've learned in post-Katrina New Orleans, and it's no mistake that New Orleans is not part of what candidates running for president in the United States are talking about right now. Because New Orleans shows very clearly the real environmental and human impacts of the United States consumer economy based on fossil fuels. Okay. Finally, it requires us to take certain transformations for granted. And the big one with the most direct implications for food sovereignty is the assumption that when these transformations occur, that people who are local food producers will be transformed from food producers to market-oriented service providers and consumers of market-provided goods and services. Now, this transformation, assumed transformation, is problematic on many levels. But even if we accept that it's an accurate description of what's going on, which I believe it's not, it's problematic because we're seeing, in very real terms, the limits of markets in delivering things like food. And that was another thing that New Orleans showed. And so if you undermine people's ability to be self-sufficient in food or have access to food through local markets, you're creating possibilities of all kinds of problems down the line when markets cannot provide those services or absorb those people as service providers.